Hello, all. We'll wait just a moment for everyone to get in. We're so excited to have you back here with us this evening. Thanks so much for being here. Just putting some notes there in the chat. All right, so we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. We're so excited to have you back for PaTTAN's book study series, Structured Literacy Interventions, teaching students with reading difficulties grades K to 6. My name's Dr. Pam Kastner, and I have the honor of serving as PaTTAN State Lead for Literacy. And from the PaTTAN East team this evening, we have the amazing Kirsten DeRoche Whitesell. She just gave you a little wave. We're so excited to have you here. Tonight, we will be focusing on Chapter 8, Structured Reading Comprehension Interventions for Students with Reading Difficulties with Dr. Elizabeth Stevens and Dr. Christy Austin. We're so excited to have them here. We have placed in the chat the link to this book study on the PaTTAN Literacy Resource Hub. Here you will find the book study schedule, information about the book itself, and a Padlet of the recordings and resources that have been curated for every single chapter. Make sure you check that out, and we will be adding that link to the chat throughout this evening. Also, we encourage you to visit the PaTTAN Literacy Resource Hub. It's PaTTAN's one-stop shop for all the amazing creations from the PaTTAN Literacy team, everything from snippets and quick picks, and even to our last literacy symposium and so much more. Check it out. All right, I am now going to turn it over to Kirsten, who will introduce our chapter authors this evening. And here you go, Kirsten.
Great. Sorry, there we go. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christy Austin and Dr. Elizabeth Stevens. Dr. Christy Austin is an assistant professor in the Educational Psychology Reading and Literacy program at the University of Utah. Before working in academia, Christy was a special education teacher, special education coordinator, and an assistant principal. Christy's research is primarily focused on reading intervention for students with word-level reading difficulties and disabilities. She is also passionate about preparing pre-service teachers to deliver research-based reading instruction. And Dr. Elizabeth Stevens is an assistant professor in the Department of Learning Sciences and affiliate faculty with the Center for Research on the Challenges of Acquiring Language and Literacy. Her research focuses on improving academic outcomes for students with learning disabilities and learning difficulties. She is particularly interested in developing and testing reading interventions, including examining the effects of aligning Tier 1 instruction and Tier 2 intervention. She is also interested in the role of vocabulary and language in the word problem-solving performance of students with mathematics difficulty. Before joining the faculty at Georgia State, she was a research assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directed several randomized controlled trials examining effective interventions to improve the literacy outcomes of students with reading difficulties and disabilities. Prior to her doctoral studies, she worked as a special education teacher for 9 years. Dr. Stevens has published high-impact peer-reviewed journals such as Exceptional Children, Scientific Studies of Reading, Journal of Learning Disabilities and Remedial and Special Education, and provides professional development to teachers across the United States. Please join me in welcoming both Dr. Austin and Dr. Stevens.
Hey everyone, we are really excited to be with you guys tonight. So thanks so much, PaTTAN and Pam and Kirsten for having us and for that really nice introduction. Christy and I, one of the things that we wanted to share with you guys as we got started is that Christy and I are both teachers. And so we both have prior experience working in the classroom. And I think that that's just a really important thing to talk about. I know that when I was a teacher sitting in professional development, I oftentimes wondered if those that were making the recommendations to me about what I should teach, if they had ever been in the classroom. And so I think that's really an important piece that I'm glad that Kirsten mentioned, is that we both have prior experience. And I can also say that we both have prior experience specifically working with this population of students in the elementary grades. So thank you so much for having us. Christy, is there anything else you want to say at the outset about your prior teaching experience?
No, just that, I mean, this was a topic that was near and dear to my heart, that I worked a lot with students with dyslexia in the early elementary grades. And I think a lot of Liz's teaching was with students in the elementary grades up through the upper elementary grades. And so we're really excited to talk about, some interventions that'll support comprehension for these students.
Yeah, so thank you guys for joining us tonight. We're excited that you've chosen to spend an hour of your evening with us to dive into talking about reading comprehension instruction. So we appreciate those of you on Twitter that provided some input on what you would like us to talk about tonight. So we really use that to guide our presentation. And what you'll notice is that most of you requested that we explain the practices that are included in the chapter, and that also we model those practices. So that's really what we've centered our talk around tonight and what you're going to see. So we're going to start. I'm just going to talk a little bit about reading comprehension instruction and why it's important to consider for this population of students. And then I'll turn it over to Christy, and she's going to explain and model the before reading practices. And then I'll talk about the during reading practices. We're probably not going to have time to go over summary writing, but we will just refer you guys to the chapter for that practice. And if you have additional questions, you can, of course, feel free to reach out to us via email, and we're happy to touch base with you about that. And then our goal is to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end of tonight for questions. So if you have questions, definitely keep those coming, and we'll hopefully get to as many as we can at the end of the evening. So where we kind of want to start a little bit to frame our discussion is to think a bit about why students that have word level reading difficulties, including students with dyslexia, why do they need structured reading comprehension intervention? Why is this something that we need to think about and consider as we're planning our intervention? And so if we think about how dyslexia is defined, which is here on the slide, and what we all know, and I know this has come up in prior sessions, the simple view of reading, what we know is that really this is a difficulty that's rooted in word reading, right? Reading at the word level. And so a lot of our discussion and our focus, rightfully so, in intervention for this population of students addresses that. But it's also important that we remember that a secondary consequence of these word reading difficulties might be difficulties in understanding text. And so we also want to be mindful of that and think of that as we're planning our structured literacy intervention. So there are a couple of reasons why students might have difficulty with reading comprehension within this population. And one reason, which is listed in the definition on the prior slide, is that when students have difficulty reading the words, they may not want to read very much, which is understandable, right? We all kind of try to avoid things that are difficult at times. So when students aren't reading as much as typical readers, then they're not being exposed to and learning the same amount of vocabulary and background knowledge as other students who are reading a lot and reading widely. So that's something that, that might be one potential source of reading comprehension difficulties. Another source might be related to cognitive load. So when students are spending all of their time and their mental energy trying to figure out the words and read the words on the page, there's not a lot of space left in their mind to focus on meaning. So that might be another potential source of reading comprehension difficulty. And then one of the other things that we know is that for students that are identified with dyslexia, that also may co-occur with a a specific language impairment. So those are just things to kind of keep in mind and a way to frame our thinking as we go forward. So there are a couple of other thoughts that we wanted to also mention briefly before we dive further and I turn things over to Christy. And that is related to thinking about strategies. And so some of you may or may not be familiar with Durkin's observation studies. These came out in the late 1970s. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about that and how that impacts and sort of frames what we, some of the conversations that are going on today around strategy use. So those observations were done in 3rd through 6th grade classrooms, social studies and reading classrooms. And the aim of those observation studies was really to examine the state of reading comprehension instruction at that point in time. And so what came out of those studies is that they found that less than 1% of the instructional time was being devoted to explicit comprehension instruction for students. And most of the time, what teachers were doing is, after reading, asking students literal comprehension questions to assess their understanding of text. Social studies and content areas were not being used as an opportunity to teach reading comprehension and also to give students rich opportunities to read and understand text. And so as a result of that, what happened is that it sort of provided an impetus for a long line of research studies on reading comprehension instruction. And then what came out of that was a lot of emphasis in studies around strategy use. And so, Christy and I talk about this a little bit at the beginning of the chapter, and hopefully you guys noted this, but, there are some concerns with strategy use. And I think there's a lot of discussion right now around that. And some of those concerns, we want to acknowledge those. I think taxing cognitive load is a concern. Another concern is, teaching isolated, strategies that, or I guess I should say, and the acronym where students have to remember the acronym and sort of the letters, what each letter stands for, and then applying that, when that's taught as an isolated skill and separate from text, that's problematic. And so what we recommend in this chapter is to choose a few practices that are rooted in evidence, but that have a few number of steps so that they're not taxing cognitive load, and to always utilize these practices connected to text so that it's supporting students reading for understanding. But we also acknowledge that these are necessary, but by no means sufficient. So knowledge building and vocabulary are really critical. So we think it's important to keep in mind that using these practices should not be at the expense of or in place of knowledge building and vocabulary building, but in conjunction with. So hopefully that frames a little bit the chapter. And then the next thing that I just want to briefly mention, and Christy, I'll hand it over to you, is that the recent IES practice guide that came out on reading interventions for students in grades 4 through 9, hopefully you guys have been able to check this out, but recommendation 3, the chapter aligns really well with recommendation 3. And so if you're interested in additional resources and examples, I encourage you to check that out, because I think that will be an additional resource for you. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Christy.
Perfect. Thanks for that introduction. So we are going to be discussing a set of instructional practices, like Liz said, and these are practices that you can use before, during, and after reading. And to us, the power of these practices is that they can really be used across content areas, and they can be used over and over and over again. And so, students can become really familiar with them. And so, like Liz said, I think it's important to remember while we're talking through these before, during, and after reading practices, that we're remembering that it's not the memorization of some quick fix kind of strategy that's promoting comprehension. It's the deep engagement with text and repeated practice. And so, just keep that in your mind as we continue to go through these. I am going to start off talking about the before reading practices. Particularly, I'm going to discuss explicit vocabulary instruction using semantic maps or vocabulary maps. And then I'm going to talk about building background knowledge. So the first thing that I want to discuss is this idea of what words we teach. And this will be familiar to a lot of people, but I think it's a necessary place to start, right? I mean, if we are looking at identifying academic vocabulary words that will be unfamiliar to students, it's important we are selecting words that are appropriate for a teaching that most students in the classroom won't know. And so, we know there's these sort of tier 1 words that are commonly used words in everyday speech, words like house, job, jump, big. We don't need to teach those kinds of words because students acquire them, even if we're talking about English learners who might have limited English vocabularies, they acquire them very naturally through everyday conversations. We want to focus on these tier 2 vocabulary words. These are high utility academic vocabulary words that can be found across subject areas: words like product, right? A product is a good or material that's being sold in social studies. It's also, the product of a multiplication problem in math. There's these words that we see in different contexts. They might even have different meanings in different contexts. Or words like predict and compare. These types of sort of academic vocabulary words students encounter and are asked to do again and again across subjects. And then there's these tier 3 vocabulary words, these subject specific academic vocabulary words that we see in one particular subject area. So, in science, it might be a word like condensation. In social studies, it might be a word like colonist. So my recommendation would be to select tier 2 vocabulary words when possible, because they're high utility and you'll see them across subject areas. So they give you a really good bang for your buck. But if there's a tier 3 vocabulary word that's really critical for understanding a particular passage, it might be worth it to pre-teach that vocabulary word, knowing that students would have a challenging time comprehending a passage without knowing the meaning of that word, and you believe it might be unfamiliar to students. And so I would recommend selecting sort of 2 to 3 tier 2 or tier 3 vocabulary words that are essential for comprehension of a particular passage, remembering that we're keeping passages relatively short for students to promote sort of students' monitoring of their own comprehension. All right, so why pre-teach unfamiliar vocabulary? We know that as students move from the early elementary grades to the upper elementary grades, texts change. And so, these expository texts students are expected to read and understand become increasingly complex, and they have an increasing number of academic vocabulary words that are likely unfamiliar to students. Not only are there more challenging vocabulary words, but those words tend to carry the meanings of the passages that students are reading. And so if they do not know the meanings of those words, they will have a hard time understanding the text they are reading. We also know that explicit vocabulary instruction supports students' understanding of unfamiliar words and their comprehension. So we're not just teaching these words so students know the meaning of those words, but so that they can better comprehend the passage at hand. We know struggling readers do not readily acquire new vocabulary through independent reading, one, because they're focused on decoding and that's taxing their cognitive resources, right? We also know that students engage in independent reading less frequently when they're struggling readers and than their proficient reading peers. And so, explicitly pre-teaching some of these vocabulary words might be a critical way to support their comprehension. So we are recommending, there's many ways that you can explicitly teach vocabulary. We recommend in our chapter using an essential word routine, which, in which teachers pre-teach these unfamiliar vocabulary words and the meanings of those words using a semantic map and a routine that can become really familiar and consistent to students. All right, so let's take a look at what some of those are. So, to me, the power of this routine is that, these semantic maps can be used across content areas. And so this particular map is one that could be used in social studies. And I want to just look at for this slide, I want to just look at the particular parts that we would see on one of these vocabulary maps, because, as a teacher, that is going to be part of your job, is to prepare these vocabulary maps to use with students to explicitly teach the unfamiliar vocabulary words that you've selected from the passage. And so, on every single vocabulary map, you will see the target word at the top. For students who are English learners, you might have like a cognate or a translation for students, because that can be an easy way to supply some more information to students. And then you would have a student-friendly definition. I personally really like learnersdictionary.com. I don't have any connection to them at all, but, sometimes dictionary definitions can become more complex than like the word itself or trying to explain the word in some way. And I like learnersdictionary.com because I think it gives a pretty student-friendly definition. Sometimes as a teacher, you can even simplify definitions from there and make them increasingly student-friendly. And then some synonyms or related words. And then a picture that shows kind of a visual representation that makes that word come to life and more vivid. We know pictures can act as mnemonics, they aid in memory. And so, it's really important to provide students with a picture and to discuss that picture when you're explicitly teaching the vocabulary so students can learn the meanings of these unfamiliar words. And then finally, students would have 2 example sentences. The first example sentence would relate to students' everyday life. And the second example sentence would relate to the unit of study or the passage at hand. And so, if the sentence is really clear, and sometimes words are used in strange ways in sentences where, there'll be a pronoun referent that if you don't include other sentences, it would be sort of hard to determine what the sentence means. But sometimes you can take a sentence straight from a passage and you could discuss that sentence straight from the passage and it could be really well used there. Other times you might have to tweak passages to make that make more sense. So we recommend using all of those parts of the semantic map before reading, that you would provide the word, the student-friendly definition, the synonyms, discuss the picture, and why it's an appropriate picture to represent that word, and that you would provide students with the example sentences, and you would do all of that prior to students reading the passage. These turn and talk prompts, we would recommend you come back to at the end of reading, after reading, to continue sort of advanced discussion of using these words in students' own vocabulary and speak in their own language and speech, in order to have them sort of master what that would look like and sound like as they answered these questions. And so, you know, as teachers, a lot of times you would ask the question. The first question would relate to students' either prior knowledge from the unit of study or from a prior unit of study, or it might relate to their everyday life or their own experiences. The second prompt would relate to the particular unit of study, so that students could discuss what they had just learned and read about. But the key here, you know, a lot of times teachers might provide sort of a sentence stem or a sentence starter for students, so that, you know, you would prompt students to use that word in the sentence, because we know it's important. Students aren't just sort of hearing you model the use of that word, but that they're able to use that word themselves. And so, you know, if you said, tell your partner about a time you showed compassion toward others, you wouldn't just ask that prompt and then let them go, because they might say, well, one time I was really nice when, so you could prompt them to say, one time I showed compassion to others was, and you could provide them with that sentence stem, and that could be helpful. All right, so I want to model what this could look like with another vocabulary map. So this is a semantic map from science. So if I was teaching this, Liz, would you be my student for me?
Yes, I had
Perfect.
to.
Great. So the word is analyze. What word, Liz?
Analyze.
Good. Analyze. Let's read the definition together. Analyze means to study something closely
and
carefully. Good. So analyze means to study something closely or carefully. We know that there are synonyms or related words for the word analyze. Synonyms include words like examine or interpret, or related words might be something like break down. And so, you know, we want to make sure that when we're studying something closely and carefully, we are analyzing it. You know, examine is a really related word, because we're also studying something really closely when we're examining it, right? So Liz, what do you see in the picture on this semantic map?
I see that she's examining something really closely.
Yeah, she is. So she's examining a model of a molecule is what it looks like to me. And she is examining it closely. What is she doing that's showing you she's examining that closely?
Well, she's holding it kind of close to her face, and it looks like she's looking at the parts.
Yes.
And it looks like she's thinking really hard.
I agree. I think she is. She seems to me to be looking at it closely and carefully. What's our vocabulary word that means the same thing as that?
Analyze.
Analyze. Great. Excellent job. So I want to provide you with two example sentences. The first sentence is, she analyzed the system of levers and pulleys to understand how the machine worked. We did a science unit, Liz, last unit, we were talking about machines and levers and pulleys. So if you were analyzing levers and pulleys, what would you be doing?
Oh, kind of almost like we're examining, or we're looking at it closely.
Yeah, good.
System closely.
Excellent, excellent. You'd be looking at that machine really closely. The second example sentence is, after an experiment, scientists analyze the data to see if the hypothesis is true or false. So, you know, if you conducted an experiment, you might analyze the data, you might look at your data to see what happened. You would examine that data very carefully, or analyze the data carefully to see whether your prediction or your hypothesis came true. All right, so I would do all of that. I would pre-teach all of that before I dove into reading. You know, and so I just wanted, Liz, if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to provide, you know, rather than go through this example again, I don't want to go through and model another example, but I just wanted to show that, you know, this is another example that could relate to English language arts, right? That these semantic maps can be used across subject areas. It can be used in social studies, in science, English language arts, you know, any of these subjects that students will encounter. And that, you know, you can choose as a teacher ways to simplify or make these more advanced and complex. And so, you know, one of the things I really like about these semantic maps is that, you know, it provides a lot of extra practice for students to read. You know, when we're talking about students in the upper elementary grades, there's a lot of text here that students can help assist you in reading. You know, you can read the definitions together, you could read the example sentences together. You know, if you're talking about students in the earlier elementary grades, this could be simplified, and it could be just the top part of this map, and the other parts you have on the back of the map that you're just doing orally, right? Students aren't reading as much of that. It's not so overwhelming in text, but you know, you could kind of simplify this or make it more advanced depending upon your students' needs. And so that's one thing I really, really liked about it. All right, so the next thing I'm going to discuss is building background knowledge. And so I want to talk about background knowledge for a minute. If you go to the next slide, Liz, that'd be great. But, I want to talk about background knowledge for a minute, because I think one of the things that ends up happening whenever we're starting to talk about building comprehension, and I was sort of guilty of this as a teacher myself, but when we are trying to build comprehension skills in students, one thing that we struggle with as a teacher is like, hey, how do we do this in a meaningful way, right? And we know that students have to develop deep vocabulary knowledge and deep background knowledge in order to understand texts. And that there's no strategy alone in and of itself that is going to help students get there if they do not have sufficient background knowledge about a topic. And so one of the really important things we recommend is that rather than practice these sort of instructional practices with these randomly selected texts, that one way that we can really build deep background knowledge in students is by using texts that are sort of thematically related, or creating units of study that follow a similar theme or similar subject content area. And that helps students build much deeper knowledge about a particular topic. And so, in this example, I've pulled together a little example of what this might look like. And so rather than practice, getting the gist, which is one of our comprehension practices that's coming next, and doing that with a passage on Rosa Parks, and then doing it with a passage on the water cycle, and then trying it again with a passage on, the election process, right? And having these random topics, we recommend selecting a unit of study and then finding these thematically related passages, because that's going to build much deeper knowledge of your students. Also, imagine the sort of power of students being able to use vocabulary that they've learned for each one of these passages across those unit of study, right? I mean, if they've been taught all of these different vocabulary words for the water cycle, and they're discussing that water cycle, they're still going to be using solids, liquids, and gases that they learned here in water states of matter. And then they're also going to be using, the words like evaporation and condensation later when they're talking about summarizing the water cycle or retelling what happens throughout the process of water cycling through Earth. And so, there's a lot of power in sort of selecting these thematically related passages. And so I just described, I showed what that could look like for one particular topic. I picked, passages related to the water cycle. You might have water states of matter, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and then you might have a sort of a summary type of reading all about the water cycle. And so our first recommendation to build background knowledge is writing a big idea statement that relates to the unit's overall sort of study or theme, right? Because we want to always draw students back to, hey, what is it we're learning about? Why is it important? And so, for this particular topic, I modeled what this could look like. This could look like telling students, remember, this unit, we are learning about how water can change states. It can change from a solid, liquid, or a gas while moving within the Earth and the atmosphere. And so that's just an idea I'm constantly going to come back to, this idea that water can change states as it moves through Earth's surface and its atmosphere. All right, so you want to remind students of the big idea of that study, and then you want to remind students of the previous day's learning. So you want to connect that big idea to what they learned the day before or previous to this lesson, and then you want to sort of next remind them of what they are learning about today. And so to connect it to the previous day's learning, you might say, yesterday we learned about water states of matter. Water can be a liquid like rain, or the water we see in lakes, rivers, and oceans. Water can be a solid, like in the form of sleet or ice. And finally, water could be a gas, like in the form of water vapor. And then you're going to situate the students' new learning, what they're going to read about this particular passage within the larger unit of study. You're going to build any background knowledge you think they might need, and you're going to offer a purpose for reading. So let's kind of break down these statements. I want to situate the new learning within the larger unit. To do that, I might say something like, you guys remember that water is constantly moving through Earth and the atmosphere. I'm just situating that, remember? So that's kind of like drawing students back to that big idea, right? And then I want to build some background knowledge. And so I've selected these pictures to model what that might look like for this particular topic. I might say something like, today, we are going to be reading about evaporation, or how water changes from a liquid to a gas. And so, I might ask for students, in this picture of the water cycle, where do you see a liquid? They might draw their attention here to the river or the lake or the ocean, whatever this is. And, and you would say, that's right, water's in liquid form there in this ocean. And so, we are going to be talking about evaporation. Evaporation is what happens when water changes from a liquid to a gas. And you can see it here. Water rises when it becomes a gas, so I'm just building some background knowledge. I have some pictures that demonstrate evaporation occurring. What happens, Liz, if you put a pot of boiling water on the stove and you leave it there for a really long time?
There's a lot of steam that rises up.
Yeah, exactly. That water changes to steam. It changes forms from a liquid, and that steam you see is a water vapor. It's a gas, right? And it rises up. Great. Liz, what happens if it's a really, really hot day outside and you have a puddle of water that you see on the concrete? What happens to that puddle of water over time?
It usually goes away.
Yeah, it goes away because that liquid changes to a gas, and we no longer see water vapor as it's rising through the air, right? And so it's not really that it goes away, it just changed forms and it's rising up through the air. And that's what's happening in this water cycle when we see evaporation occurring, right? So I think I would stress here, I want to take a pause and I want to say, the stress here is I don't need a lot of time. All of that took about a minute, right? I don't want to build tons and tons of background knowledge. I want this to be really quick and brief, because the goal is for students to get to reading, right? I don't want to, I could do this unit, I could teach about the water cycle in an English class, right? And the goal isn't for students to become expert water cycle. The goal is for them to understand this passage they are about to read and to build some deep knowledge about this particular topic. And so then finally, I want to offer a purpose for reading. So I've done just some brief background building, knowledge building. Now I want to offer a purpose for reading. So while you read, think about what causes evaporation to occur. So I've just offered a quick purpose, and students would then go on to reading a passage, and they're going to read all about evaporation and what causes that to occur. But I've offered something for them to think about while they read. All right, Liz, I am going to hand it back over to you.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Christy.
No problem.
One thing that I want to mention really quickly, which is a good follow-up to Christy's vocabulary discussion, is that I know that a lot of the resources that we're going to show you tonight were at the back of the chapter, chapter 8. And so you could photocopy them, but you also could go to greatmiddleschools.org, which is a website for middle school matters. And this is part of an IES funded study and some development work that we did with teachers. And that grant was awarded to the University of Texas at Austin. It's a project that I'm a part of and Christy's also familiar with. And so what we have under the resources tab are these instructional toolkits. So under reading, if you go to that essential words routine toolkit, you can find that vocabulary map and a downloadable PowerPoint. And so if you use, say, Smartboard, or you want to create those maps in PowerPoint, it's a lot more user-friendly, I think, than photocopying it. So that's, and then there will be other resources in the generating questions and get the gist toolkits that I'm going to show you tonight that you might want to access there as well. So just know that that's available to you. So if we situate sort of where we are in terms of the lesson, so Christy's gone over the before reading practices, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the during reading practices. So we'll dive into questioning first, and then we'll talk about get the gist before we wrap up with time for questions. So question writing, if you think back to what I mentioned at the beginning about those observation studies that done by Dolores Durkin in the late 1970s, the person that was doing all the heavy lifting with asking questions was the teacher, right? So in this particular practice, what we do is we have the students do the heavy lifting for asking and answering the questions. So in this practice, we have students stop at predetermined points in the text. So after reading maybe a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs of text, and they will look for specific information or important facts, flip those facts into a question. So they'll generate their own question and answer their questions. And they will write that on a log and cite where they located their text evidence on the log as well. So the reason that this is helpful is because it help students to monitor their understanding. So to stop after brief sections and make sure that they have thought about and understood what they've just read. And it also helps them to focus on the important information and to remember that important information. So the steps in question writing are really simple because we remember we talked about not wanting to tax students' cognitive load. We want it to be a really simple set of steps for students to follow and also to apply across different types of texts. The other thing is that these practices can be used across content areas. So you could use this with a science text, a social studies text, or an English language arts reading text. So with question writing, step one is that students read the section of the text and they can read it independently in small groups or pairs. Then step two is that they pause at regular intervals to generate their own questions and write their answers. And then step three is that they answer their questions and they cite text evidence. So this is a cue card or you can also use it as a poster. This is available on the website that I shared earlier, greatmiddleschools.org. It's also on the guiding questions document that's posted on the Padlet at the bottom. So you all may be familiar with, most of you are probably familiar with QAR and the different levels of questions. And some of the feedback that we got as we were developing these materials with teacher input is that it was too much to have all of the levels. So we really tried to simplify the question types to just focusing on literal comprehension with specific questions and then wide questions. And that's our higher level, asking higher level questions. So with specific questions, you'll see that here. The goal is literal comprehension, but with the wide questions, we focus on inferential comprehension to support students with making connections across sections of text and also applying content. It also supports making inferences because students are encouraged to make connections between what they've read and information that they may already know or have previously read. So there are a couple of supporting handouts or documents that students will need. So this cue card or poster, which you can find on both of these on the website, lists the questions, right? Each question type describes it, provides possible stems and examples for students. And then there's a log where students can write their question, answer, and text evidence. So I'm going to model both specific and a specific and a wide question for you guys using a very short section of text. I want to note that before I do this, that this text is pretty simple. It's not very complex, and that's really intentional for two reasons. One is that we don't have a lot of time tonight. So there's not a lot of time for me to read multiple paragraphs. The other reason is that when you initially introduce and model a practice like this, you want the text to be easier for students because you want them to focus on applying the steps. And then once they've learned the steps, you can start to have them practice and apply it with more complex text. So there are a couple of reasons for that. So when you model, you want to be sure to read the text aloud. You're going to stop at a predetermined point and actually model coming up with a question. How do you locate a fact and flip it into a question, and then model for students how you would answer that and write all three of those pieces of information on a log or some type of graphic organizer if you don't use the one that's provided. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to go ahead and model this. So remember, we're talking about a specific question. So in this case, I'm going to use this passage, and this passage is about clouds. It's called What Are Clouds? And so I'm going to focus just on this paragraph here at the bottom. So how do clouds form? The sky can be full of water, but most of the time you can't see the water. The drops of water are too small to see. They have turned into a gas called water vapor. As the water vapor goes higher in the sky, the air gets cooler. The cooler air causes the water droplets to start to stick to things like bits of dust, ice, or sea salt. So remember, everyone, I'm going to write a specific question. And if we look at our cue card at the top of the page, I want you to put your finger on our icon. So remember that a specific question can be answered in one word or one sentence. So I can put my finger on it in the text. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to locate a who, what, when, where, why, or how fact in my paragraph. Now I could ask the question, and you may be thinking this, how do clouds form? Because that's the heading for this section, but that's actually a wide question. And so I want you to remember that, but we're going to put that to the side for now. We'll come back to it when we get to wide questions, and we'll talk about it later. For now, I'm going to ask a specific question. Remember, I can answer that in one word or one place in the text. So I remember this paragraph talking about the sky being full of water, but that you really can't see the water because it's actually turned into a form. The droplets are in the form of a gas called water vapor. And I underline that here in my paragraph. So because this describes a reason why you can't see the water droplets, you can't see water in the sky, since it's a reason, I'm going to ask a why question, because why questions ask for or the answer to a why question explains a reason. So I'm going to ask, why are drops of water usually too small to see in the sky? And the third thing I'm going to do is check to be sure that my answer comes in one place, and it does. And the fourth thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to write my question and my answer on my log. So why are drops of water usually too small to see in the sky? Water droplets are too small to see because they turned into a gas called water vapor. And I found the answer, my text evidence, is in paragraph 2. So that's an example of how you might model a specific question. Now, you guys may be thinking, I mean, specific questions are probably going to be a lot easier for students to master than wide questions. And how quickly you introduce wide questions after teaching specific questions will really depend on your students. Some students need a lot of opportunities for practice, but some students may be more ready to dive into wide questions pretty soon after you introduce specific questions, because they are easier to teach and easier for students to master because they're more literal. So once your students are ready for wide questions, you're going to go ahead and introduce and model how the process for asking a wide question, which can be more complex. So you may need to model this multiple times because there are different types of wide questions. So you may start off with something like this. Students, we've been writing specific questions while we read to help us understand and remember what we're reading about. Remember, specific questions ask about a single important fact or idea from the text. You can put your finger on the answer to the question in one place. Today, I will tell you about a wide question. Wide questions are broader and ask about a big idea from the text. The answer may be in different parts of the same text. The answer may be in the text that you're reading and another text that we're reading, or the answer may be in the text and in your head. So it might be a connection between what you're reading and information that you already know. I'm going to use the same paragraph to model this for the sake of time. So remember that for a wide question, the answer can be found in multiple places and requires more than one sentence. And so we see that with our icon up at the top left. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to locate facts in 2 or more places in the text. So if you guys remember that the heading for this section is actually a question that we talked about when we read this passage before. How do clouds form? And we didn't use this question because it's a wide question. So we're going to go ahead and use it now. I know that this section talks mostly about what happens when a cloud forms. So let's look at those facts. First, it tells about how drops of water are really too small to see, but they turn into a gas. And then as that gas or water vapor rises higher in the sky, the air cools. And when the air cools, then it starts to stick to things like particles in the air, like dust and ice and sea salt. So all of those facts are steps in a process that describes how clouds form. And since these facts tell about steps in a process, I'm going to ask a how question. How do clouds form? So I'm going to write my question and my answer on my log. I'm also going to make sure that my question can be answered in multiple places, not just in one place, but I need information from multiple places in the text. And that's true, yes, because I can see that I underline multiple facts here. So I'm going to go ahead and write my question, how do clouds form? And my answer, a cloud forms when water vapor rises in the sky. When the air cools, droplets stick to dust and ice. And then my text evidence, I located the answer to my question on page 1, paragraph 2. So you would want to actually write this out if you were modeling this for students. And obviously we're in a Zoom room, so that's a little more difficult to do. But you would want to model that process, which we tried to do by showing you guys the underlining in that portion when you're identifying the facts and talking about how they might be related. But you want to do a lot of that think aloud for students, and that's really important so that they can see how you're identifying important information in the text and then flipping that into a question, whether that's a specific question or a wide question. And then another thing to think about, is those headings can be really important. They're also important for generating GIST, and I'll talk about that in a second as we move to GIST in the next couple of slides. But encourage students to utilize those, because those text features and information texts are really helpful in organizing the information, and can sometimes be a helpful clue on what's important in that section of the text. It can be, students can also utilize it when they're generating main ideas. So that's the next thing that we're going to talk about. So when you're teaching students how to get the gist, and this is also very similar sort of in the why to question generation. So students are stopping after reading brief sections of text, but instead of asking and answering a question, they're generating a main idea statement or a gist. So this is essentially teaching them a process, a set of steps to pull out the most important information in that section of text. And this is really important, we know from evidence, because it supports students with remembering the most important information in the text. It also helps them to monitor for meaning, which question generation does as well. So both of these practices support monitoring. And it also can help students to integrate information across sections of text, just as with question generation, especially those wide questions. So in step one, students are taught to ask themselves, who or what is this section about? In step two, so that's identifying really the main topic. What's the big topic that we're talking about? In step two, they ask, what is the most important information about that topic? So if step one is frogs, then in step two, they would say, what's the most important information about frogs in this section of text? And then for step three, they simply combine the answers to steps 1 and 2 to generate their gist. So it's pretty simple to remember these steps. Just as with the questioning practice, you would want to give students supportive materials. So you want to give them some type of cue card that they can refer to, either post it in your room or give an individual cue card to students so they can refer back to it as they're learning and remembering the steps. Once they know the steps, they won't need it, but initially this will be important. This cue card is on that website that I shared with you guys. I'm not sure if that's in the chapters, or that might be an additional resource. And then here's the log. Now, this log may work fine for students that, by the way, don't be deterred by the website saying middle school. You can use this with students in the upper elementary grades and even in the high school grades. So just don't be deterred by the name of the website. Don't think it's only for middle schoolers. So students may not have enough room. Some students have challenges with writing, and so this may not be enough space. And if that's the case, you can easily adapt this and provide additional lines, a different type of organizer that's more supportive for students. So just know that you don't have to use sort of the table format. So when you're modeling forget the gist, you're going to do that in a very similar way as you did for question generation. So you want to be sure to read the text aloud, stop at a predetermined point, make sure that you have a target gist in mind. And then you'll model asking those questions 1 and 2, and then combining the answers to steps 1 and 2 to generate the main idea students. The main idea statement. You're going to walk students through that entire process. So I'm going to use again the same paragraph so that it, in the interest of time, because I know we're running out and I want to be sure we have time to get to your all's questions. But the other reason that I wanted to use this is because I think it shows that whether students are generating a gist or they're asking a question, particularly the wide question, they can still get at that important information, whether they do one practice or the other. So I think it's a helpful way to show how they're both important at helping students get at that key information that they're reading about. So in this case, I would start by walking students through. So step 1, I know, is to ask myself, who or what is this section about? Well, I know that this paragraph really talks mostly about clouds. So I think clouds is the most important what. So I'm going to write down clouds next to step 1 on my log. And then the second step in my get the gist process is to ask myself, what is the most important information about clouds? So I know here that this talks about how, clouds are forming, that water vapor is in the sky, that it rises, and as it rises, the air gets colder, and then the clouds start to form because that air, as it gets colder, starts to stick to particles like dust, ice, and sea salt. So in my log, I'm going to write forms when water vapor rises, cools, and sticks to particles in the air. And then for my gist, I'm going to combine steps 1 and 2. Clouds form when water vapor rises, cools, and sticks to particles in the air. So, and then obviously after you model, students may need additional models. And then you would want to have opportunities for guided practice where you do it together. So asking students, what's step 1? They recall step 1. So let's decide together, what do we think? Who or what is this section about? And then what's the most important information about the who or what? What we don't have time tonight to go into some of the challenges that can kind of come up around main idea statements. Students that have reading difficulty often like to pull out details that are most interesting to them instead of thinking about the most important information. And so there's some ways that you can support students with that. And I would refer you to the practice guide, because they talk about ways that you can encourage students to use the text features like headings. If there aren't headings, you can add them in a text initially to help support students. The other thing that you can do is teach students about text structure. So if students are reading a problem solution passage, the gist is likely going to tell the problem and the solution, right? So if they have some awareness of text structure, that can help them in identifying and extracting the most important information in the text. So that's sort of another fix-up practice you can use when students encounter difficulty. So with that, I had a couple of other modeling examples for this, but I think in the interest of time, so that we have plenty of time for questions, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Pam, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I did send you a number of them. We've had a couple more come in recently, but I sent them both to you and to Christy. Just let me know if you got them. And if not, I will just ask you. I'll just go right to the document and ask from there.
Yeah, I can see, Christy, are you able to see the first one about vocabulary?
The first question was from Karen. What would it be good or helpful to also teach or include antonyms for the targeted vocabulary words? Is that the one you're seeing?
Yes.
Okay.
Christy, you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, I do see it. Do you want me to tackle that one, Liz?
Sure. Go for it.
So, I mean, I think, there's never any harm, I don't think, in talking about both synonyms and antonyms. I think one of the powerful things about talking about synonyms and using examples rather than non-examples is that, students are walking away with a really clear understanding of what the definition is, what the meaning is, and then how is it used. My only concern would be if you're just using sort of 2 examples, if you do 1 example, 1 non-example, would students leave with some confusion of which one was the example and which one was the non-example? So as long as you are certain students have clarity, I would say no concerns, no worries. I think it could be powerful.
The next question was about how many words you would pre-teach.
So, I mean, I would recommend selecting just 2 to 3 per day. I think if you're teaching too much more than that students are unlikely to retain that amount of vocabulary knowledge. And any fewer than that, I think you're probably not maximizing their amount of learning that they could do.
There was a question about the great site that you shared, the middle school site. Is there semantic maps on that site? And if so, are you aware of a primary source for similar resources?
Yeah, so the greatmiddleschools.org has the template that's in the chapter and that Christy modeled with tonight. So if you're interested in that template so that you can create your own maps, that's where you would find it. But already created maps are not on that website. So, and these take some time to create and being thoughtful about it, making the decisions like your illustration and student-friendly definitions. So, collaborate and divide and conquer with colleagues so that it's not so much on your plate. There is, Christy, are you aware of a primary? There are some other maps that are geared more towards, or that offer some different sections, but have some of, I guess, some overlap.
I used a sort of modified version of that semantic map for my dissertation study, and I'd be plenty happy to share it with Pam, and who could then put it on the portal. And it does very much the same thing as that map. It just does a bunch of that orally rather than including it all in the semantic map. The semantic map just has a word, a definition, and a picture. And the rest is done orally and includes some sort of modeling on the back of the card. So
The
I'm
other
happy to
place
share
you
that.
might, oh, sorry, Christina.
No, go ahead, Liz. Sorry.
The other place you might go to is there's been some studies that from UT that have used some versions of maps with fourth graders. And that website is, I think it's the Meadow Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And I think it's meadowcenter.org. And so you may have to hunt around because I'm not sure exactly where it's located now, but there should be some student-friendly, elementary-friendly versions of that map that you might find useful.
And someone just shared in chat that Reading Rocket's website has a good selection of graphic organizers for vocabulary as well. So
Nice.
All right, maybe I'll squeeze a couple more in. Do you give students the text evidence paragraph as a tool in developing skills? That came from Josette.
So I'm not sure I understand the question. So maybe if Josette can provide a little more. Christy, do you?
I'm not sure I understand
Okay,
either.
so
Hi.
yep, thank you,
Whenever
Josette.
you showed the example, you showed what paragraph the text evidence came from. I was just asking, do you provide that in advance as part of a scaffolding?
Yes, I would actually, so like here, I mean, this is actually a bad example because the one is in the wrong place, but you would want to number your paragraph so that when they go to cite their text evidence, they can say what paragraph they found it in.
All right, thank you for Josette for jumping in there. Appreciate that. Next question was, how can one help learners who have difficulty knowing what it is the most important information about the who or the what?
Really good question.
Yeah, so I think that's the honestly this was what my dissertation study was in this exact thing, because I found as a teacher that I really struggled in how to teach my students to identify the important information when they were reading. I think it's not an easy thing to do. And so the best way to support students is something that I think it's challenging, right? But the practice guide, I'll give you a couple of suggestions, which is kind of where I was going with what I was saying at the end after the GIST example, is teaching students to utilize those headings, because those often can provide a clue. Like, for example, on this page, that whole paragraph is talking about cloud formation, right? So that really can give students helpful information. The other thing is pairing, GIST with text structure. So I think teaching them a set of fix-up practices when they encounter difficulty, and it's usually with step 2. Usually they don't have trouble with step 1, but step 2, that determining what's the most important information, can be the really tricky part. So if they're aware of text structure, that can really help them. If it's a description paragraph, if it's talking about a cause and an effect, then their main idea statement will really align well with that, the structure of the text. That doesn't always work. So it's important for students to have, a lot of practice widely with a lot of different types of text. I think, practice opportunities really matter. And it's important for us to avoid, quick fixes or tricks like, it's always in the first sentence or it's always in the last sentence, because as you guys know, that's oftentimes not true. And a lot of times, the most important information needs to be inferred or put together across ideas in the paragraph. It's not going to be explicitly stated. So those are a couple of suggestions.
All right, I think we have time for just one more because it's a quick one. Can students, this is from Renee, can students work in groups initially to get used to completing the forms?
You want to take that one, Christy?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a great practice to have students work with partners at first, or in small groups, and then, move towards independence and individual work. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to make it right in under the wire. Kirsten is going to close us out. But before she does, just a quick reminder, of course, to thank our presenters who did an amazing job and modeled this lesson that was so important for us. And thank you so much for really responding to what our folks wanted to see, and for all the resources. I was busy, as Kirsten was, trying to get them all on the Padlet, and we'll probably go back and just to make sure that we got everything that you offered. Thank you so much for that. Just a reminder too that the Patent Literacy Symposium is in, oh my gosh, I cannot believe it, just 2 weeks. As you know, we have a number of amazing presenters, the world-renowned, who will be joining us, and we currently have 3,000 people registered for the symposium, if you can believe that. So if you haven't registered yet, as Kirsten is giving you information about our closing, I'll put it in the chat. There's still time for you to join us. And thank you again to Dr. Austin and Dr. Stevens, an amazing presentation once again. And I know I'm going to go back and listen again because I was busy like getting all those resources there, and I don't want to miss a minute of what you said. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us, Pam.
Yeah, really. Thank you guys so much.
And thank you all for joining us for this evening's rigorous discussion on Chapter 8 of the book Structured Literacy Interventions for Students with Reading Difficulties. And again, many, many thanks to Dr. Stevens and Dr. Austin for your thought-provoking resources and the information you provided this evening. So for everyone that's on, if you're interested in re-watching the recording of this presentation, it will be added to the Patent Literacy Resource Hub, which can be found, and let me see if I can clip this in here. The link for that hub is, I'm going to enter into the chat right now. And there you have that. And you can also find it at a later date when it'll be uploaded to the Patent YouTube channel. If you're looking for Act 48, please click on the form link and the exit code for this session. And I'm going to enter that into the chat right now. What we would recommend is that if you have the ability and you can do it, to do it today, right now, if you're able to, the form that I just entered is the exit survey. And the exit code for this session is KREO. Please note that you must complete this form by midnight to receive Act 48 credit. So as we said, if you're able to do so, we suggest, if possible, that you complete that form now. Please remember, if you're planning to join us in the future, the Zoom link and the passcode will remain the same for every session. And the Zoom link for the session and the passcode was sent to you in an email from PaTTAN. We look forward to having you join us once again next Wednesday, June 8th, 2022, from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern for Chapter 9 of Structured Literacy Interventions for Written Expression with co-authors Susan Smith and Charlie Haynes. And thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.